On a windy afternoon in August 1974, a 16-year-old boy stood on a fence line in Converse County, Wyoming, watching a convoy of oil company trucks roll across the prairie. The trucks came in a cloud of dust so large it looked like a storm front moving across the land. Surveyors, engineers, geologists, men in press shirts carrying maps, men who spoke in numbers, men who believed they understood the ground beneath their feet. The boy's name was Caleb Mercer. His family's ranch sat on 640 acres near Douglas, Wyoming. Not a large operation by local standards. Not a rich one either. Just enough cattle. Just enough hay. Just enough luck to survive another season. Caleb leaned against a weathered fence post and watched the strangers unload equipment onto land that had been purchased only weeks earlier. 8,000 acres. A fortune in grazing land. Bought by a rapidly expanding oil company from Houston, Texas. Their plan was ambitious. Exploration roads, drilling pads, storage yards, temporary housing. The company expected to transform a quiet stretch of Wyoming prairie into a major energy operation. Everyone in town was talking about it. The diner, the feed store, the grain elevator, even Sunday church services. Some believed it would bring prosperity. Others worried it would change the county forever. Caleb worried about something else. Water, specifically where it traveled, because unlike the men arriving with maps, Caleb had spent his entire life watching the land itself. Every storm, every flood, every dry spell, every spring thaw. He knew where snow drifted. He knew where runoff gathered. He knew which gullies looked harmless until they suddenly weren't. And he knew something the oil company did not. The ground they were building on wasn't nearly as stable as it appeared. 3 days later, Caleb rode his horse across a section line and found several engineers studying stakes in the soil. One of them looked up. "Can I help you, son?" Caleb pointed toward a broad stretch of grassland. "You shouldn't build there." The men exchanged amused looks. One chuckled. "Why not?" "Water." The engineer smiled politely. "We've already surveyed it." Caleb nodded. "Then your survey missed something." The men thanked him, then returned to their maps. Conversation over. Advice dismissed. And that might have been the end of it. Except Caleb Mercer wasn't guessing. He knew, because his grandfather had taught him. Let me tell you about Walter Mercer. Walter arrived in Wyoming in 1928 with $37, 2 horses, and a stubborn belief that hard work could still matter. Most people saw prairie. Walter saw patterns. He spent decades studying weather, soil movement, grass cycles, and seasonal water flow. Not from books, from observation. Thousands upon thousands of hours of observation. When other ranchers relaxed after supper, Walter often rode fence lines. Watching, learning, remembering. He kept notebooks filled with dates. Snowfall records, rainfall measurements, creek levels, unusual floods, unusual droughts. By the time Caleb was old enough to ride alongside him, Walter could predict certain runoff patterns more accurately than some government reports. People occasionally laughed at that. Then spring floods would arrive exactly where Walter predicted, and the laughter usually stopped. When Walter died in 1971, he left Caleb something unusual. Not money, not land, knowledge, and one machine. A 1949 Oliver 88 row crop tractor, 38 horsepower, nearly 5,000 pounds. Purchased new in December 1948 from a dealer in Casper for approximately $1,800. The tractor sat inside a weathered barn beside the ranch house. Its green paint had faded. Its seat had cracked. Its steel carried scratches from decades of labor. Yet it still started. Every time, Caleb treated it almost like a family member, because, in a way, it was his grandfather had cut hay with it, pulled wagons with it, fed cattle through brutal winters with it. The machine carried fingerprints from people who were gone, and every scratch told part of their story. By September, construction accelerated. Road crews arrived. Bulldozers arrived. Heavy trucks arrived. Entire sections of prairie disappeared beneath gravel roads. The company moved fast. Fast enough that local officials praised the project. Fast enough that investors celebrated. fast enough that nobody wanted to hear concerns from a teenager, especially concerns involving invisible water. Then came October. The first warning arrived quietly. A storm system moved across eastern Wyoming and delivered nearly 3 inches of rain in less than 24 hours. Not catastrophic, not unusual, just enough to reveal weaknesses. Caleb rode out before sunrise. The ground was soaked. Runoff flowed exactly where his grandfather's notebooks predicted, and exactly where the oil company had built several key access roads. By noon, shallow washouts appeared. Nothing serious. Nothing expensive, just enough to make Caleb uneasy, because he recognized a pattern. The same pattern Walter had documented years earlier. Water wasn't merely crossing the property. It was gathering, building, preparing. That evening, Caleb drove into Douglas with his father. At the diner, conversation centered on the oil project. Excitement filled the room. New jobs, new equipment, new opportunities. At one table sat several oil company representatives. Among them was a young project manager named Richard Lawson, 34 years old, college-educated, sharp suit, confident smile. Successful enough to believe confidence and competence were always the same thing. Someone mentioned Caleb's concerns. A few people laughed. Lawson laughed too, not cruelly, but publicly. The kind of laugh designed to entertain everyone nearby. The ranch kid predicting engineering failures? Several customers smiled. Lawson shook his head. We spent hundreds of thousands on surveys. More laughter. Then he added something people remembered for years. If we're taking geological advice from teenagers, we may as well let cattle run the project. The room erupted. Caleb remained silent. He didn't blush, didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He simply sipped his coffee, waited for the laughter to end, then looked directly at Lawson. His voice stayed calm. If I'm wrong, nothing happens. The room quieted slightly. Caleb continued. If I'm right, you'll wish you'd listened. Then he stood, paid for his meal, and walked out. No anger, no drama, just certainty. The kind that makes people uncomfortable. Outside, the wind had picked up. Dark clouds gathered far beyond the horizon. Caleb looked west, toward distant hills, toward watersheds most people never considered, toward storm systems that hadn't arrived yet. Because what nobody inside that diner understood was that the dangerous water wasn't on the oil company's property. Not yet. It was still 40 miles away, and moving directly toward them. For the next 3 weeks, the weather remained calm. The road stayed dry. The drilling equipment kept arriving, and every day that passed made Caleb Mercer look a little more foolish. At least that was how many people saw it. The oil company continued expanding across the newly purchased acreage. Gravel roads stretched across the prairie like gray scars. Temporary offices appeared. Fuel tanks arrived. Survey markers multiplied by the hundreds. Richard Lawson walked the property almost daily, and every inspection seemed to confirm what he already believed. The project was succeeding. Investors were pleased. County officials were pleased. The company headquarters in Houston was pleased. The only person still talking about hidden water was a 16-year-old ranch kid with dusty boots and an old notebook inherited from his grandfather. Most people knew which side they would bet on, but Caleb wasn't betting. He was watching. Every afternoon after school, he rode fence lines, sometimes alone, sometimes with his father, often carrying Walter Mercer's weather journals in his saddlebag. The pages had yellowed with age. Some entries were written in fading pencil, others in blue ink. Each one recorded observations most people never noticed: snow depth, wind direction, creek levels, dates of spring runoff, flash floods, ground saturation. Tiny details collected over decades, details that formed patterns, and patterns that told stories. Let me tell you about those notebooks. There were 27 of them, 27 years of observations. Walter Mercer had never attended college, never published research, never appeared in newspapers. Yet those journals contained something many experts lacked. Time, real time, not months, not seasons, decades. the kind of long-term observation that only comes from living on the same piece of land for nearly half a century. One entry from May 1952 described heavy runoff crossing, exactly the section where the oil company had built its primary equipment yard. Another from June 1957 described a washout that destroyed a county road less than a mile away. Several entries referenced a natural drainage basin hidden beneath what appeared to be stable prairie grass. The basin only became active during unusually wet years. Most of the time it remained invisible, which was precisely why it was dangerous. In late October, weather reports began attracting attention. A powerful storm system was developing over the Rocky Mountains. Meteorologists predicted heavy precipitation. Nothing alarming, just a strong autumn storm. Wyoming had seen plenty before. Lawson barely noticed the forecasts. His focus remained on deadlines, construction schedules, budget reports, equipment deliveries. The company planned to begin additional drilling operations before winter arrived. Delays would cost money, and money was something Lawson hated wasting. Meanwhile, Caleb noticed something else. Snow, not in Converse County. Farther west, high elevations, mountain watersheds, places connected to drainage systems that eventually fed the lowlands surrounding the oil project. The snowfall totals kept increasing. 10 inches, then 16, then 22, then more. Most people viewed the reports as distant weather news. Caleb viewed them as stored water, potential energy waiting for release. One evening, he spread Walter's notebooks across the kitchen table. His father sat beside him. Together, they compared historical entries, storm tracks, snowpack records, temperature shifts, runoff dates. The similarities were unsettling. Finally, Caleb pointed to an entry dated April 18, 1957. His father read it silently. Then again, neither spoke for several moments, because Walter had described conditions almost identical to what was developing now. The old rancher had even written a warning beneath the entry. If heavy mountain snow is followed by warm rain, lower drainage basins will overflow beyond expected channels. Simple sentence, simple prediction. But history has a habit of repeating itself, especially when nobody remembers it. By early November, temperatures unexpectedly rose. The mountain snowpack began melting faster than expected. Creeks swelled, streams widened, water moved east. Still, nobody seemed concerned. The oil company's engineers continued relying on recent surveys, recent measurements, recent conditions, all of which suggested everything remained under control. And technically, they were correct at that moment. But land doesn't care about moments. Land remembers decades. One afternoon, Caleb encountered Lawson near an access road. The project manager was inspecting equipment deliveries. Several supervisors stood nearby. Caleb approached respectfully. "Mr. Lawson." The man turned. Recognition flashed across his face, then mild amusement. Back with another warning? A few workers smiled. Caleb ignored them. "The runoff basin is filling." Lawson folded his arms. "We've checked every drainage report. They're incomplete. We have engineers. My grandfather spent 40 years studying this ground." One of the supervisors laughed softly. Lawson shook his head. "Son, experience matters." "That's true." He gestured toward the construction site. "But professional expertise matters too." Caleb looked across the prairie, at roads, storage yards, equipment, fuel tanks, everything positioned directly in harm's way. Then he said something Lawson would remember for the rest of his life. Sometimes experience is expertise. The words lingered. Neither man realized how important they would become. Lawson eventually walked away. Conversation finished. Decision made. No changes. No precautions. No contingency plans. The company stayed the course. That night the storm arrived. Rain hammered rooftops. Wind rattled windows. Thunder rolled across the Wyoming plains. Hour after hour, the storm intensified. Creeks rose. Ditches filled. Small streams merged into larger flows. Still, nothing catastrophic happened. Not yet. The first day passed. Then the second. Rain continued. Mountain snow continued melting. Water accumulated throughout the watershed, invisible miles away, moving steadily toward lower ground, toward the oil company, toward the drainage basin, toward a lesson nobody wanted to learn. Have you ever known you were right when everyone around you insisted you were wrong? Not suspected, not hoped, known. Known because you had done the work. Known because you had paid attention. Known because reality doesn't change simply because more people disagree with it. That was where Caleb found himself, watching, waiting, hoping he was wrong, yet fearing he wasn't. On November 11th, 1974, before sunrise, he saddled his horse and rode toward a ridge overlooking the basin. The rain had finally stopped. Clouds drifted low across the landscape. The prairie appeared calm, almost peaceful. For several minutes, Caleb saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed movement. Far away, a dark line crossing grasslands. Slow, steady, growing. Water, not a creek, not a stream. A moving wall of runoff spreading across thousands of acres. Caleb's stomach tightened. He had seen sketches of similar events in Walter's journals. But seeing it with his own eyes was different. The scale was astonishing. The basin had activated, exactly as predicted, and directly in the path of the company's infrastructure. He wheeled his horse around and raced toward town, toward telephones, toward warnings, toward anyone willing to listen. The ride took less than an hour. It felt like minutes. When he reached the project office, workers were already arriving. Several stared as he jumped from the saddle, his clothes soaked, his horse breathing hard. Richard Lawson stepped outside. Annoyance crossed his face, then concern, because Caleb looked nothing like a boy making another prediction. He looked like someone who had already seen the future. "The basin's flowing," Caleb said. Lawson frowned. "What? The basin? How bad?" Caleb looked directly at him, and for the first time since they met, there wasn't even the smallest trace of uncertainty in his voice. Bad enough that if you don't move every machine you can move right now, there won't be enough time later. Lawson stared at him, then looked toward the western horizon, and that's when he noticed something that hadn't been there an hour earlier. A line of water reflecting the morning sun, and it was getting larger. For several seconds, nobody moved. Workers stood frozen beside pickup trucks. Foremen stared toward the horizon. Even Richard Lawson seemed unable to process what he was seeing. The water was too far away to look dangerous, too slow, too calm. From a distance, it appeared harmless. But distance can be deceptive on the Wyoming prairie. What looked far away often arrived much faster than expected. Lawson finally turned to one of his supervisors. "Get the survey crew." The man ran. Another supervisor climbed onto a truck and drove toward higher ground. Within 30 minutes, reports began coming back, each one worse than the last. The runoff wasn't confined to a single channel. It was spreading, filling old drainage routes that hadn't carried significant water in years. Some pathways hadn't carried major runoff in decades, which explained why recent surveys had missed them. The land had remained quiet long enough for people to forget what it could do. But the land hadn't forgotten. By mid-morning, the company activated emergency procedures. Equipment operators rushed to move machinery. Fuel trucks relocated. Portable offices were disconnected. Storage containers loaded onto trailers. Workers scrambled in every direction. Yet the scale of the operation created a problem. There was simply too much equipment, too many roads, too many assets, and not enough time. Lawson stood beside a map table inside the project office. Rainwater dripped from his jacket. The confident project manager who had laughed in the diner was gone. In his place stood a man confronting a reality he hadn't expected. The reality that a teenager might have understood something his engineers missed. Then another report arrived. A critical access road had already washed out, not destroyed, but compromised. Heavy trucks could no longer use it safely. The situation worsened by the hour. Lawson studied the map, calculated options, rejected them, calculated again. Nothing looked good. Then he heard an engine, an old engine, a familiar sound he hadn't expected. Outside the office, Caleb Mercer was climbing onto the seat of the 1949 Oliver 88. The old tractor rattled and growled as it idled. Green paint faded. Metal worn smooth by decades of use. Not impressive. Not modern. Not fast. But alive. The machine looked almost out of place among newer trucks and construction equipment. Several workers stared. One man muttered, "What's that thing supposed to do?" Caleb heard him. Didn't respond. Just checked the throttle. Adjusted the choke. And waited. Because he understood something many people didn't. Old machinery wasn't always built for speed. Sometimes it was built for endurance. Let me tell you about the Oliver 88. When it debuted in the late 1940s, farmers respected it for one reason above all others: torque. The tractor produced power differently than many competitors. Not flashy power, not headline power, working power. The kind that kept pulling when conditions became difficult. The kind that mattered when wheels sank into mud and loads became heavier than expected. Its six-cylinder engine wasn't extraordinary on paper. But paper never pulled a wagon through spring mud. Paper never hauled hay during a blizzard. Paper never fed cattle at 20 below zero. Machines earned reputations in fields. And the Oliver had earned its reputation honestly. Around noon, the first water reached company property. At first it seemed manageable. Shallow flows crossed roads. Workers watched nervously. Some even relaxed. Maybe the danger had been exaggerated. Maybe the warnings had sounded worse than reality. Then more water arrived. And more. And more. Channels overflowed. Ditches disappeared. Low areas vanished beneath muddy currents. The basin expanded rapidly. What seemed like isolated runoff transformed into a broad, moving flood. Not a towering wall. Not a dramatic wave. Something more dangerous. A steady, relentless force. The kind that keeps coming. Hour after hour. Equipment operators raced to move assets. Some succeeded. Others didn't. One bulldozer became trapped. Then a fuel trailer. Then several loaded supply containers. The ground beneath them softened faster than expected. Mud swallowed tires. Trailers sank. Machines stalled. The clock kept ticking. By mid-afternoon, company officials faced a painful reality. Millions of dollars worth of equipment remained exposed, and some of it couldn't move itself. One particular piece of machinery worried Lawson more than any other: a massive drilling support unit weighing nearly 40,000 pounds. If abandoned, it would likely be destroyed. Recovery alone could cost a fortune. Engineers examined options. None looked promising. The surrounding ground had become unstable. Larger trucks risked becoming trapped. Heavy recovery equipment couldn't reach the site. The unit sat stranded, half surrounded by mud, water rising around it. Lawson stared at the machine, then unexpectedly turned toward Caleb. For the first time since they met, he wasn't looking at him like a boy. He was looking at him like a source of answers. What would your grandfather do? The question surprised even Caleb. He looked toward the stranded equipment, then toward the terrain, then toward the old Oliver tractor. Finally he answered, "We don't pull it straight." Lawson frowned. "What?" "We pull it sideways first." Several engineers exchanged confused looks. One immediately objected. "The shortest route is forward." Caleb nodded. "The shortest route is also deeper." Silence followed, because everyone knew he was right. The direct path crossed the worst ground. The longer route climbed gradually toward firmer soil. It wasn't efficient, but it might work. Lawson studied the landscape, then made a decision. Do it. The operation began immediately. Chains appeared. Tow cables appeared. Workers coordinated positions. The old Oliver rolled forward, its engine growling steadily. Some workers looked skeptical. Others looked amused. A few openly doubted. The tractor weighed barely a fraction of the trapped machinery. On paper, the task looked impossible. But farming has always contained lessons that spreadsheets miss. Have you ever owned something that everyone else called worthless? Something old, something worn, something people assumed belonged in a museum, then watched it succeed where newer things failed? That's what dozens of workers witnessed that afternoon. The Oliver strained. Its tires dug into wet ground. The chain tightened. Metal groaned. Nothing happened. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. Workers held their breath. The engine roared louder. The tractor pulled. Harder. Still nothing. Then movement. Tiny. Almost invisible. An inch. Then another. The drilling unit shifted. Mud released its grip slightly. A cheer erupted. Not because the problem was solved. Because the impossible had become possible. The Oliver kept pulling. Slowly. Relentlessly. Exactly the way Walter Mercer had taught Caleb to work. No panic. No wasted motion. Just steady effort. Minute after minute. Foot after foot. The machine advanced. Workers added support vehicles. Additional cables. Additional manpower. But the breakthrough had come from the old tractor. The machine everyone overlooked. The machine everyone underestimated. By sunset, the drilling unit sat safely on higher ground. Applause broke out across the site. Genuine applause. Exhausted workers shook hands. Some laughed from relief. Others simply stared at the floodwater spreading across areas that would have destroyed millions in equipment had they waited longer. Richard Lawson remained silent, watching, thinking, recalculating everything he thought he knew. Then he walked toward Caleb, the same young man he'd laughed at in the diner, the same young man whose advice he'd dismissed, the same young man who had just helped save the project. Several workers noticed. Conversation faded. People listened, because everyone sensed something important was about to happen. Lawson stopped a few feet away, looked at the floodwater, looked at the old tractor, then looked directly at Caleb Mercer, and what he said next changed both of their lives. For a moment, neither man spoke. The wind moved across the flooded prairie. Water reflected the orange light of the setting sun. Workers stood nearby, pretending not to listen, but everyone was listening. Richard Lawson took off his gloves, looked down at the muddy ground, then back at Caleb. I should have listened. The words were simple. No speech, no excuse, no attempt to explain away what had happened. Just honesty, the kind that is harder than pride. Caleb nodded. Nothing more, because he hadn't wanted to be right. Being right meant the land had flooded. Being right meant people had nearly lost millions of dollars. Being right meant a lesson had been learned the expensive way. Lawson looked toward the basin. You saw all this coming. Caleb shrugged. My grandfather did. That answer stayed with Lawson. Years later, he would still remember it. Not because of the flood, because of what it revealed. The boy wasn't claiming credit. He wasn't celebrating victory. He was honoring knowledge that had been handed down to him. Knowledge earned by observation, patience, attention, respect, things modern industries often talk about but rarely practice. Over the next several days, the floodwaters slowly receded. The final damage assessment surprised almost everyone. Several roads had been heavily damaged. Temporary structures were lost. Storage areas suffered significant losses. Construction schedules were delayed. The company spent hundreds of thousands of dollars repairing infrastructure, but the disaster could have been much worse. Much worse. Internal reports later estimated that early equipment relocation had prevented losses exceeding $3 million in 1974 dollars, a staggering amount of money, and all because a teenager refused to stop paying attention to the land. 1 week later, something happened that nobody in Douglas expected. Richard Lawson requested a meeting with county officials, engineers, surveyors, and several local ranchers, including Caleb and his father. The meeting lasted nearly 4 hours. Lawson did most of the listening, not the talking. Listening. He wanted to understand the history of the area, the weather, the drainage systems, the flood cycles, the old records, the forgotten stories, everything. By the end of the meeting, the company approved major design changes. Roads were relocated. Drainage corridors were preserved. Future construction plans incorporated historical runoff patterns. And perhaps most importantly, local knowledge was finally treated as expertise rather than folklore. Let me tell you about what happened to Richard Lawson after that flood. Many people imagine humility arrives all at once. It doesn't. Real change usually happens gradually. One lesson, then another, then another. Lawson remained successful. His career continued advancing. But something fundamental shifted. He stopped assuming the newest information was always the best information. He started asking older ranchers questions, started listening before speaking, started treating experience as data. Years later, he became known throughout parts of Wyoming for doing something unusual. Whenever a project involved local landowners, he met them first, before surveys, before plans, before construction. Some younger managers thought it wasted time. Lawson disagreed. He had learned that maps sometimes miss what memory remembers. As for Caleb Mercer, life moved forward much as it always had. The ranch remained modest. The work remained hard. The winters remained long. He graduated high school, stayed in Wyoming, expanded the cattle operation slowly, carefully, the way his grandfather would have. People occasionally asked about the flood, about the oil company, about being proven right. Caleb usually changed the subject. What interested him wasn't the argument. It was the land, always the land. The years passed, then decades. The old Oliver 88 kept working. Not every day, not every season, but often enough. Hay fields, fence repairs, light hauling. The tractor never became a museum piece. Caleb refused. Machines that still work deserve work. That was his philosophy, and the Oliver seemed determined to agree. Its engine was rebuilt once in the late 1980s. The clutch replaced in the early 1990s. Routine maintenance continued exactly as Walter Mercer had taught. Oil changes, grease fittings, careful storage, respect. The tractor repaid that respect with reliability. Let me tell you about something remarkable. In the spring of 2004, nearly 30 years after the flood, a local agricultural fair invited ranchers to display vintage machinery. Hundreds of people attended. Rows of tractors filled the grounds. John Deere 4020s, Farmel MS, Alice Chalmers WD-45S. Case tractors polished until they looked new. Beautiful machines, proud machines. Yet one display attracted more visitors than almost any other. The weathered Oliver 88. Not because it was rare, not because it was shiny, because of the story attached to it. People gathered around while Caleb explained how his grandfather bought it for $1,800 in 1948, how it survived droughts, blizzards, hard years, good years, and one flood that changed a lot of minds. Children climbed onto the seat. Older farmers smiled knowingly. Many touched the worn metal, as though greeting an old friend, because in rural America, machines are rarely just machines. They are witnesses. By 2010, the original oil project had long since become part of local history. New companies arrived. New technologies appeared. New equipment replaced old equipment, but the lessons remained. Several engineers working in the region still reference the 1974 flood during planning discussions, not because it had been catastrophic, because it had been educational. The story became a reminder that data has many forms, some stored in computers, some stored in notebooks, some stored in people. In the autumn of 2018, Caleb Mercer passed away peacefully at the age of 60. He died in the same county where he had been born, on the same land he had spent his life studying. His daughter, Emily, inherited the ranch, and the notebooks, and the Oliver. She still keeps both. The journals remain preserved in a cabinet near the ranch office. The tractor remains operational. Every year, usually once in early summer, Emily starts the old machine and drives across the property, not because she has to, because some traditions deserve motion. And somewhere in a storage box, there's still a photograph taken after the flood of 1974. A muddy teenager, an exhausted project manager, and a worn green tractor sitting between them. The picture captured more than a moment. It captured a lesson about listening, about humility, about the difference between intelligence and wisdom. Some things don't become valuable because they are new. They become valuable because they have survived long enough to prove themselves. If you knew someone like Caleb or someone like Walter, someone who paid attention when everyone else was too busy talking, share their story in the comments. I read everyone. And if you'd like to hear about the Iowa farmer who saved a town's grain harvest using a steam tractor that everyone thought belonged in a scrapyard, that story is coming soon. You'll want to be here for it.